I suppose when I say Noroika Kotsu, most of you would guess I was talking about some exotic delicacy, or maybe some holiday resort in the Far East. You'd be dead wrong. A Noroika Kotsu is a very nasty object that has been part of Japanese folklore for centuries, maybe even a millennia. But please keep reading. I know that folklore, especially folklore from a completely foreign culture, bores a lot of people to snore. I can assure you, I am no fan either. But please believe me when I say that it's essential that you read this and understand what Noroika Kotsu are and how they work. As best I can translate, Noroika Kotsu means devil's jaw in English. According to Japanese tradition, a Noroika Kotsu is made with two thin boards of wood, one upon the other, that is bound together on one side with either a strap of leather or length of twine, so that the board can be opened and closed like a book or a set of jaws. A certain spell is then written upon the board to give the object its dark powers. Basically, so long as they knew the magic words, anyone could make one from household objects. And Noroika Kotsu were used to strike a bargaining with something called the Kafuka Oni, which I'm told means he who pays for his food with good luck. Don't be fooled though. Even though the name might sound benevolent, Kafuka Oni was regarded as a cruel, evil creature and was greatly feared. He was believed to have sway over the force of luck, and a person could request him to turn a near certain failure in the future into a glorious victory by writing what they want upon the piece of rice paper and then place it inside a Noroika Kotsu. But there was also a catch. Kafuka Oni would only honor the request if you nominate your payment for his services on top of the message, and the only payment he would accept was the life of someone you hold dear. It had to be someone you truly cared for, though not necessarily a family member. It could be a close friend. If you're named someone you don't really care for, or even someone you actually wanted to die, somehow the Kafuka Oni would know and the wish would not be granted. But if the Kafuka Oni approves of the nominated payment, then that person who made the wish would be blessed with the best possible luck in whatever matter they ask for the Kafuka Oni to help them with. After that, the nominated victim would mysteriously disappear, almost entirely without a trace. The worst part of the story is that after it claimed its price, the Kafuka Oni would leave a souvenir outside the front door of the person who made the wish. Sometimes it was a victim's bloody clothing or some other personal effects. But more often than not, it was a part of the victim's remains. Some people believe that it did this to traumatize the person who made the wish, to remind them of the terrible fate they placed upon their loved one. Others apparently think that it was more like the Kafuka Oni leaving a receipt behind for the person who made the wish, acknowledging that it has received its payment and that their business was concluded. Either way, making a Noroika Kotsu and striking a bargain with the Kafuka Oni were forbidden practices in Japan, punishable by death. So once the deal was done, the person who committed the crime would usually destroy all the evidence, the Noroika Kotsu, and whatever traces of the victim had been left upon their doorstep. Even if you are into old monster legends, I'm sure you probably just read this and think it's just some old superstitious hokum. Well, a few days ago, hell, probably a few hours ago, I would have agreed with you, but not anymore. I can't tell you too much about who am I or how I know what I know. What I can tell you is that I have connections in the missing person turned homicide investigation of a teenage boy somewhere in Midwest. About a year ago, it had led up to Halloween. There was this meme going around, the picture showing the top of a skeleton, the skull, neck, and shoulder blades. People would forward it in with this MMS message, tweets, and like with simple messages like Happy Halloween or Boo, etc. You might have gotten one yourself. Eventually, the meme found its way to somebody with a bit of acknowledgement about anatomy, and they realized that that skeleton in the picture was awfully realistic. They reported it to the law enforcement, but it would be weeks before the report could make it through the bureaucracy to the medical examiner, who verified that the image did indeed warrant some investigations. The Emmy was convinced that the skeleton was indeed a genuine article, but of particular concern to her in the pinkish tone of the bones and the trace amount of what appears to be blood and flesh still on it. What also concerned her was a series of scrape marks that could be seen on the bones when the photo was examined in a high resolution. They appeared to encompass an entire skull, and the Emmy's opinion was that there was made when the flesh was stripped off the body, but something with very sharp and very hard teeth. There seems to be no legitimate reason for the photo like this to circulate among the public. Law enforcement determined that it was either a lead crime scene photo or evidence to his as yet uncovered crime. They concerned that the photo might have been taken by some curious private citizen who found the body, photographed it, published it online, and never reported it to the cops. Even more disturbing was with the possibility that the photo was published by the psycho who had done this and wanted the world to admire his handiwork. The trouble was that we only had one photo to go on, which made it really hard to determine whether or not the photo was related to an active or a solved case. The EXIF data, the data buried within the JPEG file that detailed where the photo had come from, what camera had taken it, and what had been taken, etc., had all been wiped clean, which isn't hard to do if you know what you're doing. All we had to go on was the photo itself. I won't bore you with the technical details, but sufficient to say that the computer forensic tech made a thorough sweep of the National Crime Scene photo database and determined that the photo didn't pertain to any case in the digital archives. Several other analyses were run on the photo, but the one that paid off was a facial recognition simulation, a piece of software that scans the photo of the skull and determines what the guy would have looked like when he was still alive. Eventually, we were able to match a reconstructed face to the active case file out of state. The skull belonged to a teenage boy, let's call him Jack, who had been reported missing. While the photo itself was being investigated, the meme was also being examined. We were charting the course back to the concerned citizens who initially reported the image to the police, to the first person who have sent the image. It wasn't easy, as the meme would leapfrog back and forth across several popular messaging services along its way. Just over a week after the victim's identity was confirmed, we were able to determine who had started the meme. We'll call her Jill. What was immediately interesting to the law enforcement was that Jill's name was already on record in Jack's case file. She was apparently a school friend of his and one of the last people to see him alive. A warrant was issued for Jill's cell phone and she was brought in for questioning. Right away, there was something odd about the situation. The cell phone built-in camera was a far lower resolution than the photo. The phone was thoroughly analyzed and the MMS was recovered containing the skeleton photo. But while the phone had definitely recorded and received the message, it was later discovered that Jill's service provider had no record of any transmission the MMS to her. Another weird thing about the sender ID and the MMS didn't contain any numbers. It contained only encoded Japanese kanji characters. This is technically impossible. The way that the system is set up, the phone should have only been able to log a series of numeric digitals into the sender ID field. The characters in the sender ID spelled out Anato Shitakoi. This isn't someone's name. The tech translation it and discovered that it roughly means your employee or your business partner. Under interrogation, Jill recalls receiving an MMS. She said that the message kind of creeped her out, especially because it came from an unknown sender, which is what the message software told her, because it wasn't able to interpret the invalid sender ID. But because it was close to Halloween, she assumed that one of her friends sent her a seasonal thing, so she forwarded the cool creepy photo on, starting the meme. According to the MMS timestamp, she received it only a few hours after Jack was last seen. But Jill claims she never linked the message to Jack's disappearance in her mind. Because it was that time she received the MMS, she didn't even know Jack was missing. The detectives grilled Jill for over 3 hours, but when she began to get really upset, her father ended the interview, and without hard evidence, the detectives couldn't hold her. The tech who analyzed the phone? Well, let's just say that he's very thorough at his job, and he didn't give up on the mystery on how this phone could have received an impossible MMS. That is, the service provider had no record of ever sending. He dug deep into the software, looking for an explanation. Eventually, he came up upon a curious anomaly embedded in the phone's firmware. More encoded Japanese characters, this time a long block of them. The firmware is supposed to be just universal machine code to tell the phone how to work. Japanese text, or text in any human language for that matter, doesn't belong in there. But as intriguing as the discovery was, it still didn't explain the impossible MMS. At least, that's what we thought at the time. You see, the Japanese text was garbage data, which means it was worked into the firmware in such a way that it had no actual effect on how it worked. It was on the phone, but it wasn't doing anything. By this point, I was involved in the investigation. And when I learned about the Japanese text in the firmware, I got curious. So I ran it through a Google Translate. It didn't translate well though. A quarter of the words weren't even recognized, and the ones that were didn't make any sense together. Frustrated, I called upon the Japanese American acquaintance to translate for me. I expected it to be a manufacturer copyright on the firm code, or perhaps even the programmer signing his work. But it's actually turned out to sound more like a somber poem of sorts. My Japanese American friend agreed, saying that the language was far from elegant than day-to-day Japanese, and more than a little archaic. Seeking answers, we phoned up in the phone manufacturer developing lab in Japan. We eventually got through to the manager of the team who developed the phone software, and with my friend acting as translator, we asked him about the mysterious text in the firmware, and also if he had any explanation as to how the Japanese phrase could have been recorded in the sender ID for an MMS on one of their phones. He very politely denied knowing anything about either of these matters and assured me that any garbage data is a firmware was no consequence. Still wanting answers to at least one of the mysteries, I phoned the professor of Japanese literature at Tokyo University to see if he could recognize the verse of the firmware. Before my colleague could finish reenacting the verse, the professor cut him off. He recognized it all right. Despite the language barrier between us, I could hear the discomfort in this man's voice as he explained that the verse was an incantation written upon a Noroika Kotsu to give them their dark powers. It was at this point that my colleague explained that the Noroika Kotsu legend to his culture to me. He knew the story well. He had just never heard the actual incantation used to create one. Until now. While it was all quite educational, it really didn't get us anywhere in terms of the investigation. But I kept thinking about the problem of the MMS, and eventually I had this crazy thought. The fact that Jill had received a photo of Jack's remains was eerily similar to the part of the Noroika Kotsu legend where the monster would leave behind some proof of his victim's death. I suppose just for fun, I skimmed through the rest of the case notes to see if there was any other parallel between the murder and the Japanese legend. I almost wish I hadn't. When I read through Jill's original witness statement, the one taken when the police were just investigating Jack's disappearance as a missing persons case, she remarked that she remembered that the last day she saw him clearly because it was the same day her history teacher had returned to the test and that she surprisingly aced, even though she thought she was sure to flunk it. My stomach sank when I read the statement, because I was quite familiar with the context of Jill's phone, and I remember reading about this history test before. About 3 days before Jack's disappearance, Jill typed the text message into her phone, "I need to pass this history test. Jack's name was marked on the top of the message as the intended recipient. The similarities between the old stories I've been hearing and the murder were suddenly clear as day. Jill had a phone that was for some reason contained an old Japanese spell used to summon a monster. She typed what could have been interpreted as a demand for a good history mark into her phone with her close friend's name on the message. And just like in the stories, Jill aced her test. Jack disappeared without a trace, and Jill received a sick memento of his death. If you pointed this out to me at the time, I would have chuckled and say, yes, and it's a weird coincidence, isn't it? I wanted to believe that this was all it was. I really did. But deep down, in that hidden doubting Thomas part that we all have that doesn't completely trust modern rationality to be our salvation, I was frightened. Then a couple of days ago, which was about a week after I called the phone manufacturer, I received a package in the mail. There was no return address, but the postmark was from Osaka, Japan. Inside were a heap of papers. On top of the stack was a cover letter explaining what the package contained. It was written in bad English, although I was able to get a gist of what it was saying. The sender didn't identify themselves, but it's clear that they must work in the manufacturer of Jill's phone and that they were aware that I've been asking questions about the hidden text in the firmware. My informant was part of the development of the phone series that Jill's phone belonged to, and she had an explanation for how the Noroika Kotsu incantation had gotten into the phone's firmware. There was a guy on the development team, smart, but a real emo loner type. Not the shy kind of loner, the crazed gunman in the making kind. People would try to be friendly and reach out to him, and he stared daggers at them. For whatever reason, that guy had issues. Shortly before the phone series went into production, the guy hung himself. My informant believed that before he died, the guy implanted a hazardous spell into the phones in his ultimate screw you to the world. Within a few months of the phone's release, somehow the company's excavation got wind of this, and there was a problem that received disturbing MMS that the phones seemed to be generating themselves. The company began to investigate the problem quietly themselves, secretly quarrying all their active phones remotely. They found scores of incidences where the phone had a record of incoming MMS from Ananato Shinataki, your business partner, containing a single JPEG file. Most people would have received these messages had subsequently deleted them, but in several dozen cases, the JPEGs were still in the recipient's phone and were retrieved by the company. An upgraded version of the firmware was that the incantation removed was developed, but ultimately never implemented because it was discovered that the phone keeps rejecting it. The guy who put an incantation in the firmware had also rigged it so that it would never allow itself to be overwritten. 2 months before Jack's disappearance, the company abruptly terminated their investigation. But this time, they were aware of nearly 800 instances of MMS being received from Ananato Shitokai. An unspoken agreement was made that the problem was unsolvable and their best course of action was to simply turn a blind eye. Everyone involved in the informal investigation were forced to sign a non-disclosure agreement. Orders were issued to destroy all the records, but my anonymous contact managed to keep copies of most of them, which she has sent to me. It has taken me a while to get through the documents she sent me, as most of them were written in Japanese. But luckily their list of the phones that received a Ananato Shitakoi message was written in regular digits. I ran all American numbers in the list through our database, and all of them, every single one, belonged to somebody who was questioned the relation of the missing person case that had begun within days of them receiving that message. But that's not the worst of it. The worst of it is that my contact also sent me a printout of all the JPEGs they could salvage that turned up during the manufacturing investigations. They are all just like the photos of Jack's remains that began this entire case, a realistic skeleton grinning on the camera. A realistic skeleton grinning into the camera, covered in scrape marks left, but whatever sharp-toothed nightmares stripped them of all their flesh. I don't have access to any advanced software to synthesize the accurate face of Jack's skull. At least, not the kind of access that allowed me to use it without answering a lot of difficult questions at first. But I scanned the photos and overlaid them into Photoshop on the top case photos of the missing person associated with the recipient. I admit I'm no expert, but as far as I can tell, every one of those skulls fit perfectly inside the face of one of those missing people. I can't tell you the name of the manufacturer involved or the name of the phone series involved. Suffice to say that they are a well-known company and the phone series is quite popular. I wish I could tell you more, but if I do, I would have no doubt that the company will have this warning suppressed as defamation, and I can't let that happen. The word has to get out, and I figure that half a warning is better than no warning at all. There's a common series of phone out there with an evil curse marked inside them. You may well be carrying an Noroika Kotsu in your purse or pocket. And even if you aren't, someone who cares about you may be. So please, be wary of typing out what you wished for, or hoped for, or even think you need. But most of all, be especially careful of whose name you placed on that message, because you just may be sending them into the devil's jaws. Spread the word.